So variable or reference parameters, and in contrast to value parameters, these or this type of parameter will let us change the object in the method, and those changes will be reflected in the original object. And what we're doing here is we're really passing a reference or passing the address of the original object. So inside the method, you're actually operating on the original object. So any changes you make are changes to the original object, and we'll see that. Now it gets a little tricky because there might be a different name for the original object inside the method. Now we didn't implement this in the time class. I'm going to go back to the time class, and if you want to implement it, that's fine. I'm going to define a swap method, and you'll see how this is going to work. But what I want to do is, if I have two time objects, I just want to swap their hours and minutes, okay? And we'll see an implementation of the method. But in order to implement this method, I have to be able to modify this time object. And I'll go through it where we pretend that this is just a value parameter, and we'll see what happens. In fact, you should do that. You should code it up and remove the ampersand here. This is what makes this a variable parameter, the ampersand, right? Well, code this up and remove that and see what happens, and you'll see that this method no longer works, okay? Because what we'll be doing is we'll be swapping a copy, and we're not swapping data with the original object. That's why we need this variable parameter. We need this swap operation to be reflected in the original object that we're using. So remember that we have these two private data members, hours and minutes. All right. So to implement this, I am going to, as a void return type, and it's a member of the time class, a method of the time class called swap, and I'm going to pass in a time object by reference. And all I want to do is I want to take the hours out of this time object and put them in this time, and take the hours out of this time object and put them in this one, and the same thing for minutes. So it's a pretty simple, and swapping, I mean, there are a lot of swapping methods that come in handy. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to create a temporary variable for hours, and I am going to store this object's hours in that variable, and now I can say that hours is equal to this time object's hours, and now I can say time, I can take this stored value all right, so I'm just switching them around. And now I'm going to do the same thing with minutes. I could reuse that variable, but I'll go ahead and just create another one. So now I'm going to take the minutes out of this time object and store it here. And then I'm going to take the value in temp minutes just like that. So that's my little swap method. And in order for this to work, the change that I make to time here and here, right, that's where I'm changing this object, those changes have to persist after this swap method terminates. So And what I'm actually going to be doing here is because I'm using a reference parameter, yes, I am changing the parameter time, but because I'm using a reference parameter, I'm actually changing the original object that I passed into swap. So let's see how this works in main. And I'm going to create two time objects, T1, and let's say that this is 1:15, and time T2 is 3:45. Let's do that, just so we can kind of keep them straight. Now, if I'm going to swap these, I want T1 to have T2's value and T2 to have T1's values, right? And to call swap, I can use either one, but I'm going to say T2 swap and pass in T1. Okay? And so on and so forth. So first of all, let's look at the memory we have. So here's T1, and this of course is in main, and it has an hour and minutes, hours and minutes, and the explicit constructor is going to set hours to 1 and minutes to 15. Okay? And T2 in main is going to do exactly the same thing with the values. A little explicit here, so this is memory. All right. All right. So this is what memory looks like at this point in execution, right before we call swap. So let's call swap. We get an activation record, right? And we have the formal parameter time, just like that. Okay? Well, because this is a reference parameter, time is really just, within this method, time is just another name for T1. So really what I'm doing here is time is T1. All right? So any changes that I make to time, I'm really making them to the object T1 because this was the actual parameter. Okay? Right? So inside the swap method, time is just another name for T1. And, maybe there's a better way of drawing this connection out, but this is really what's happening. So let's execute this. So in the activation record, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a local variable called temp hours. And in that, I am going to store hours. Well, in here, so it's the swap, I'm calling the swap method of the T2 object. So this swap method, I'm calling it on T2. So the reference to hours evaluates to 3. So I'm storing 3 in temp hours. And now I'm taking time hours, the parameter time hours, which is 15, and I'm storing that in T2's hours. So 3 now is going to get changed to 1. Then I'm taking temp hours and I'm storing it in time hours, but time hours is really just T1's hours. So temp hours is 3, so now I'm changing T1's hours, so our times hours to 3. Then I create another variable called temp minutes, or temp mins, and I store in it minutes. Well, this is the swap method that I'm calling on T2, so I'm storing 45 here. This evaluates to 45, and I'm storing that in temp minutes. So 45 goes there. And then time dot minutes, that's time the parameter, which is really just another name for T1. This is going to evaluate to T1's minutes, which is 15, and I assign that into T2's minutes because it's the swap method of the T2 object. So 15 will get stored in the private data member of T2's private data member minutes. Now I take the value in temp minutes, which is 45, and I assign that to time minutes times the parameter, reference parameter, which is just another name for T1. So I'm storing 45 in T1's private data member minutes. And so you can see already that I've just swapped these values. Now when this method terminates, and again, put in some cout statements in here to kind of watch what's going on. When this method terminates, this activation record goes away, it's deallocated, so any local variables, temp minutes and temp hours, those are deallocated, and the ability to refer to T1 as time, this parameter, that also ceases. Okay? And we go back here, and if you say T1.print and T2.print, then this is going to print, well, what is T1? It's 345. And what is T2 print going to print? It is going to print 115. Okay. So the reason this happened, the reason we were able to change T1, now T2 would have gotten changed because the swap method belonged to the T2 class, right? We called to the T2 object. We called the swap method, of the object T2, but we were passing T1 in as the parameter, and the only reason its values changed was due to the fact that we declare this as a reference parameter. So a good question would be, well, what happens if we make this a value parameter? So let's take a look at that.